Welcome to Super Nutrition Academy's Health Class with your host and registered holistic nutritionist, Yuri Elkaim. Tune in each week for up-to-date insights on breaking health news and best practices on how to eat for awesome health. It's time to get smarter, healthier, and regain your sanity in a world of information overload. And don't forget to join Yuri at supernutritionacademy.com so you too can master your nutrition and health.
Welcome to the first episode of the Super Nutrition Academy Health Class. I'm Yuri Elkaim. I'm really excited to be with you today to get this podcast started. We're going to start off with a foundation lesson today. We're going to be looking at some really cool stuff and what we're going to do every week. And sometimes I'll be doing more than a weekly podcast if there's more information that I want to share with you. But essentially, what we're looking to get out is a weekly podcast that will give you some really cool insights and opinions about some really recent and in the news type of health related stuff. So this week we're going to be covering, or in every podcast, we'll be covering about 3 different areas of discussion in relation to a central theme. This first episode we'll be talking about the difference between natural and synthetic. And that's kind of the overriding theme within what we're going to be discussing today. And it's going to be really cool because I'm going to pull up some really interesting studies about butter versus margarine, sugar versus artificial sweeteners. We'll even look at fructose versus fruit. And we'll discuss those 3 areas in relation to the concept of natural versus synthetic and what our bodies really need to thrive. Now, before we get into that, I'm gonna share some current news with you about my life, some cool little things, again, in relation to the topic for the current week. And we'll also go into some very basic fundamentals so you understand the underlying concepts and the science behind why this stuff makes sense. So if that, hopefully, that makes some sense to you. So that's kind of the format we'll be approaching with these different episodes over the Health Class podcast. And I'm really excited because this is it's off the cuff. I'm not scripting anything. I have some kind of general outline of where I want to go with things. But if I stutter and stumble and throw in a couple of likes and ahs, then you'll know why. It's really just kind of fresh and off the cuff. That's the way I like to do things. And I'm really excited that you're here with me. So let me just share something with you that I think is very pertinent to today's discussion about natural versus synthetic. So I was at a coffee shop this morning doing some work by my house, and the owner of the coffee shop was asking me, she's like, so I understand you're a holistic nutritionist, so I was wondering what your thoughts are on microwaves. So my answer to her was, well, basically, to give you a very quick answer, we don't have a microwave in our house. So when we bought our house a couple of years ago, we redid the kitchen, and there was this big honking microwave over the stovetop, like a lot of people have in their kitchens. And when we redid our kitchen, we said, you know what? We don't even want a shelf for a microwave because we're not even going to use it. So if you came to my kitchen, you would not even see a microwave in it. That's just because we don't use a microwave. And so that was my answer to her. And just I thought it was very time appropriate, considering this lesson is all about natural versus synthetic. So I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but when you microwave things, the consistency and the texture is very different. It comes out a lot mushier. If you're ever kind of reheating baked goods, for instance, they don't come out crunchy like the topping of the baked good would be a little bit, kind of golden and crunchy from the oven. You don't get that with a microwave. The microwave just kind of nukes it and really denatures it. It changes the molecular structure of the food that you're putting into the microwave. And in addition, if you're look at all these microwave ready to go dinners. It's disgusting. I grew up on this stuff, so, I'm pretty well versed in this. But anyways, you take one of these plastic containers and you put it in a microwave, and you have your dinner in there. Those it's tiered off into 3 different portions to give you your meat and your sugar-infested sauce on top of it and whatever else. And then you've got this cellophane or this plastic coating, this wrap on top of that. Well, if you know anything about heating plastics, you know that that's not a good thing to do, and especially if you put it into a microwave. So just as a quick little discussion here, heating plastics gives off xenoestrogens, which are like fake estrogens, if you will, and they tend to be leached out of plastics when we heat them. So that's why if you have a water bottle sitting in the sun, one of those kind of very easy to squish water bottles, like a Nestle water bottle, for instance, that you buy at your grocery store. those plastics leach chemicals and xenoestrogens into the water supply, into your water. And that's a very, very big problem nowadays because we're seeing more and more estrogen dominance as a result of things like that in men and women. So that's just one reason why I don't recommend microwaves. So that's just kind of what's new with me this week that I thought it was really kind of funny that it happened this morning before recording this for you. So let's get into the fundamentals for this week. The fundamentals we're going to be talking about really boils down to this. The human body recognizes natural, not synthetic. Okay? That's really, I think this first episode, we really need to establish that foundation, because when you consider where we've come over the last 100 years in terms of human health. Now I'm going to separate this for a second because we have made tremendous advances in medical science with all sorts of pharmaceuticals and vaccinations and all that stuff that's helped us live longer and prevent a lot of airborne and communicable diseases, right? So that's one thing. That's fine. Excuse me as I clear my throat here. That's one area that's fine. But when you look at lifestyle diseases, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, obesity, the big four, we have made absolutely no headway. And in fact, we've actually things have gotten worse over the past 100 years. So in the early 20th century, in the 1900s, in the early 1900s, you didn't see the levels of obesity and cancer or heart disease that you see nowadays. So why is that? Well, there's a lot of different reasons. Obviously, there's a very different food supply that we have access to now. A lot of it's processed garbage that was not available 100 years ago, right? So the people always say, if your grandparents never ate this, then you shouldn't either. That's a very simple way to think about things. When you go to your grocery store nowadays, anyone in their right mind who's actually health conscious would stick to the outside of the grocery store. So the produce aisle mainly. Okay, those aisles in between there, everything in there is full of is packaged, it's boxed, it comes in a can, and when that happens, it's loaded with synthetic ingredients that are man-made as a way to increase shelf life, as a way to increase the flavor and taste of foods. And when you consume those types of additives and synthetic ingredients that don't naturally occur in nature, and even if they do, a lot of, cocaine is natural, doesn't necessarily mean it's good for us. But when you look at things like BHA and BHT, MSG, sulfites, stuff like that are so common in packaged foods, and the detriment that they cause to human health, it really is upsetting. Okay, so we need to start thinking about: is this food that I'm eating, is it as close to nature as possible? Is it as close to its natural form as possible? And if it's not, how was it created? Okay, so let's look at the example of organic frozen pizza. Okay, so you go to your grocery store, you go to the frozen aisle, you see, oh, it's organic. It must be good for us. You grab the box, you put it in the shopping cart, and you go off. Well, a lot of people are misled and they're misinformed, and they're led to believe that, by choosing organic pizza or organic cookies or organic whatever, that it's good for you. Well, the reality is that that's not necessarily true. If you look at the ingredient list and there's a ton of garbage, a ton of stuff in there that really doesn't need to be in there, then you probably want to bypass that food and look at something else. Actually, here's a great example of this. Probably about 2 years ago, there was Oprah on her show did this vegan challenge. So her and her staff did this vegan challenge for a week. And there was the expert, I'm not going to name her name, who was on the show, was this vegan expert and a nutritionist. And so she was on the show helping Oprah and her staff go through this whole thing. And I'll never forget this. They showed a clip of Oprah and this nutritionist going to Whole Foods. And obviously Whole Foods is terrific because of all the great produce and stuff they have there. But what they showed shocked me, because I'll never forget this image, and I still have it in my head, is that they were going down the aisles and they had this shopping cart. Okay, so her and Oprah had this shopping cart, and it was just chock full of stuff in boxes and packages. If you saw the episode, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. If you don't, you can just search online, go to YouTube and search in Oprah's Vegan Challenge or something. You'll find it. And it made me cringe because millions and millions of people are watching this episode and they're thinking, well, if I'm going to go vegan, I have to be eating tofurkey, processed like fake sausages, stuff that comes in a package, and she was going to these different aisles and showing Oprah, well, if you don't want to have real beef sausages, you can have these fake tofu sausages, or if you don't want turkey, have tofurkey. I mean, it was ridiculous. And looking at the shopping cart, there was not one single item that was considered a fruit or vegetable in there. It was all soy-based, heavily processed vegetarian vegan foods. Sure, it wasn't real cheese, it was fake cheese. Does that mean that just because it's vegan is good for you? Absolutely not. Right? I know a lot of people who are vegetarians and vegans who are disgustingly unhealthy because the basis of their diet is around these garbage packaged processed foods that are derived from heavily genetically modified and non-organic soy, in addition to lots of grains and cereals and pastas and stuff like that. So you can be vegan, but not in the right way. So the goal is to eat more plant-based foods if you're going to be vegan, obviously, in their natural state. Eating more fruits and vegetables, choosing things from the produce aisle, so that when you go to check out, the cashier is complimenting you, saying, "Wow, that's a really healthy grocery bill there," not just not piling up packages of foods. So it really comes down to the human body. We were put here on this planet to recognize foods that are also natural to this planet. When we start relying on foods that are coming out of laboratories, synthetic processing plants, it really becomes problematic. So that's the foundation, and I hope you understand that to begin with. Obviously, I'm not going to beat a dead horse here, but I think it's very intuitive that natural in general is better for us. Okay, again, I'm not going to say that doing cocaine and marijuana is necessarily good, even though those are natural substances. But in general, okay, anything that is coming from the earth is generally better for human consumption than anything that is coming from a processing plant. Okay, and that's. I mean, you can look at supplements. The supplement industry, study after study shows that the efficacy and the health benefits coming from whole foods, not the store, but actually like eating, fruits and vegetables, in terms of their antioxidant properties and all their health benefits, is greater than from supplements. And that's because supplements don't contain all those synergistic compounds that we find in natural whole foods. Okay, all those little brother and sister molecules that help us absorb more vitamin C or calcium or whatever it might be, we don't get that necessarily, at least at this point in time, through supplements. Okay, so we always need to look at how do we get more natural foods into our diet. You can think about just a very simple acronym is LOW, local, organic, and wild, right? So a very, very simple way of thinking about things. Is this food local? Is it organic? Is it wild? Is it coming from nature? All right. So with that said, let's get into this week's news topics. I'm kind of bouncing back and forth here between my two computers to going from screen to screen to get all this information to you. So what I want to start with is this. So I was reading, I was going online doing, I don't even know what I was searching for online, but I came across a really interesting study that was just published really at the middle of February. This, it came online, but this is something that's been in discussion for a long time, and that's the notion of butter versus margarine. Okay, so here's the headline: Butter versus margarine, new research reveals which is healthier. So that's pretty fascinating, right? And right off the bat, the first sentence says, margarine isn't better for your health than butter. It's worse, according to a new analysis of a 40-year-old study. So here's the gist of this study. So this study looked at individuals. They collected data between 1966 and 1973, and these are people who had replaced butter with vegetable oils. And we'll probably talk more about this topic of unhealthy fats a little bit more in the future, because it's a very, very important. It's probably one of the most important topics to really understand with respect to human health. So they replace saturated fats like butter with vegetable oils. And, if you go to your dietitian now, they'll tell you still, have canola oil instead of using butter for frying purposes, which is ridiculous. So anyways, they looked at 458 men who already had cardiovascular disease. And again, these are people who had replaced butter with these, vegetable oils. So when I'm talking about vegetable oils, I'm talking about like safflower oil, canola oil, the things that you see in the supermarket that are not olive oil, that are not omega-3 fish oils, that are not coconut oil. So really everything else outside of those actual good oils. Okay, so I'm just kind of sifting through here. And again, the notion for this is because there was some really sketchy science that was very, very influential in and around that time, which basically showed that, if we had more saturated fat, we would have more heart disease. But we now know that that's not necessarily true. Okay, so there's some pretty faulty science back then, but it led to the American Heart Association, as well as the pretty much any kind of heart-related association around the world, to adopt the same view that saturated fats were bad because they were saturated fats and there was cholesterol associated with that, and these vegetable oils were better. But the reality is that this study is just one of many to refute that and show quite the difference. So the problem with margarine. Okay, so I'm just kind of giving the synopsis here. The synopsis of the study was basically they found that those who had already had cardiovascular disease and took out butter and replaced it with vegetable oil had a greater likelihood of a repeat cardiovascular incidence and high blood pressure and all sorts of other stuff. Okay, so butter was essentially better than margarine in this case. And margarine, the problem with margarine is that it's based on using these vegetable oils. Okay, so margarine initially was produced by and the initial technology was to take an oil, and how do you get an oil to make it more solid? Well, you have to take it through a process called hydrogenation. And if you're familiar with that, hydrogenation produces trans fats. So for many years, and even to this day, some margarines still contain trans fats, others do not as much anymore. But essentially, margarine was just loaded with trans fats because of the technology of hydrogenation. We're taking these like a canola oil, which is liquid at room temperature, and turning it solid. Again, simply because people thought or were led to believe that butter is bad. So therefore, if we're going to spread butter on toast, let's spread margarine instead. So how do we get margarine? We take a vegetable oil, we hydrogenate it, and we turn it into a spread. At the time, they didn't understand how bad trans fats were for the heart. Now we know that trans fats are one of the worst, probably the worst type of fat that we know of in existence. And the reason for that is because it is very, very damaging to the cell membranes around your cells, which inevitably impact the integrity of the cell walls of your blood vessels and create more free radical damage and all sorts of other stuff. So it's not a good thing. They also raise LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol in your blood, which inevitably increases your risk for heart disease. So we know that stuff is bad. And the other thing with these oils is that they're not very stable for cooking purposes. Okay, so anything that's liquid, if you're in a room and room temperature and it's liquid, it's generally a unsaturated fat. That's kind of essentially what that means, is that it has one. I'm not going to get into the chemical structure here, but I'll try to make it as easy for you to understand. If it's liquid at room temperature, it means that it's an unsaturated fat. Okay, so vegetable oils are types of polyunsaturated fats, which means that they have several double bonds in their chemical structure. They're very unstable. They're very sensitive to light, heat, and oxygen. So when you leave oil sitting out in a bowl, that's not a good thing to do because light, heat, and oxygen are going to turn it rancid. And when you consume that oil, rancid oils are probably, I would argue, the most damaging of all foods you can put in your body. That's why French fries, potato chips, all those baked goods where they're using, fried oils or just really poor quality oils are very bad for you. Okay, so, anyways, so that's what this study showed, and I want to bring up another study that was even more enlightening. So, this was actually there. So there was a big study. One of the biggest studies along these lines of kind of saturated fats was the Framingham study, which was done a long time ago. And so there was a recent study, or not so recent actually, 1997, and they followed the participants from the Framingham study, again, which is one of the most influential studies done in relation to fats and heart disease. Okay, so this study they tracked for 20 years between 1969 and 1980, and they compared butter and margarine in this specific study. So what they found was that, okay, so the thinking at the time was that people who are consuming margarine are generally more health conscious, right? Because if the messaging and the marketing is all about, well, margarine is this healthier alternative to butter because now we've been led to believe that butter is bad for us, well then health conscious consumers are probably going to be choosing margarine, right? Because that's what they do. If people believe that cow's milk is not as healthy, then they turn to soy milk. And if they understand that soy milk is not as good for them, they turn to almond milk or hemp seed milk or nut milk. So that's just kind of the way things go. So anyways, this study, really interesting stuff. So they looked at, okay, what's the correlation between butter consumption and heart disease, and what's the correlation between margarine and heart disease? So what they found was that for those consuming or eating basically if you didn't have butter or margarine, your risk of heart disease was what it was. As soon as you went from 1 to 4 teaspoons per day, which again is very, very achievable for most people, that's like 1 tablespoon pretty much, very achievable for most people. So 1 to 4 teaspoons of butter or margarine roughly led to about the same amount of coronary heart disease. Margarine tended to increase, had a slightly higher risk, but it wasn't statistically significant. However, as soon as we went from 5 teaspoons and more, and again, that's not a lot. That's very, very spread margarine on your toast. You're looking at about 5 teaspoons right there, more or less. So as soon as we went to the 5 or more teaspoons per day, the margarine group doubled their risk of coronary heart disease versus the butter group. Okay, so let me repeat that. 5 teaspoons or more of butter per day versus 5 teaspoons or more of margarine per day. Those who were eating 5 teaspoons or more of margarine per day had double the incidence, not the risk, the actual incidence of coronary heart disease. Okay, that's significant. So another cool thing that they did with the study. So then what they did is they took these results and they kind of cross-tabulated them with lifestyle factors that could, maybe confound, maybe these margarine people are smoking a lot and they're drinking a lot of alcohol. Maybe they have like really poor blood sugar tolerance. So let's control for all this. So what they did is they took these groups and then they controlled for those different variables. So here's where things get even more interesting. So remember how I just talked about how people who are consuming margarine are generally more health conscious, right? So here's what they found. So those people who had the greatest amount of margarine per day also had the best glucose tolerance. They smoked the least, they drank the least, and they consumed the least amount of butter per day. Okay? So all of these variables you'd think were protective against heart disease. So these people are doing this already. However, they were consuming huge amounts of margarine, and that fact alone was a huge impetus in them doubling their risk of coronary heart disease. So what does this come back to? So again, it comes back to our discussion about this first episode. It's all about natural versus synthetic, right? As soon as you start playing, that's the whole Jurassic Park syndrome, right? As soon as you start playing God with these different compounds, our bodies, don't necessarily know how to react with that stuff. In nature, trans fats don't exist. There's the molecular structure of trans fats don't actually exist in nature. Okay, I'm not going to get into the configurations of cis bonds and trans fat bonds and stuff like that, but I go into a lot more detail about this stuff in Super Nutrition Academy if that's something you want to look into. But just understand that trans fats don't naturally occur in nature. They only occur as soon as we start hydrogenating things, like obviously vegetable oils. So it's very, very problematic. And obviously the human body does not respond very well to that. So that's the butter versus margarine. And if you were to take one thing away from that discussion, it is that butter is better than margarine. Okay, so if you've got margarine in your fridge, I would highly encourage you, just as soon as you finish listening to this podcast, to go throw it out. And if you're choosing butter, make sure that it's organic, right? So you're not ingesting antibiotics and hormones and all that garbage that they're being, feeding some cows. And just make sure that's a good quality organic butter, and then you're fine. But don't go crazy with the stuff. Again, butter is not the problem. It actually contains very short-chain fatty acids, which are in most cases metabolized as fuel. The actual chain, the length of the chain of butter is not long enough to be stored as fat. Okay, so it's really, really fascinating stuff. Again, don't go crazy on it, everything in moderation, but butter, again, is natural. It comes from, a real thing, so that's your best bet. So that's the first health bit, the health, our kind of health news for this week. Now, the second one we're going to move into is, again, just another fascinating area of discussion. And this one is all about sugar versus artificial sweeteners. And, you could replace the word artificial with non-calorie, zero-calorie sweeteners like aspartame or saccharin or whatever it is you want. So I'm just going to pull up some interesting stuff here for you. I'm just trying to find where we had this last bit of information. Okay, well, I can't seem to find the information for whatever reason. I think I've misplaced that the little news piece, but I'm going to kind of paraphrase it here. So I was going through again, I think this was on CBC News in Canada here. They had an article on artificial sweeteners linked to greater levels of type 2 diabetes as well as obesity, which is very shocking. You're like, what? How does that even make sense? A sweetener that has 0 calories increases my risk of type 2 diabetes and obesity? How does that even work? Well, here's some really interesting stuff to pay attention to. So just give me a second as I'm typing in the URL here. I'm just going to take 2 seconds. Okay, so I'm back. All right, so here's the interesting thing. So there's this, again, I'm trying to really remember this from the most recent research that was done. This was done with 16,000 women in France, and this study was done, it was conducted or published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And they found that women drinking, I believe it was 500 milliliters of diet soda per week versus 1.5. Okay, so they found that there's 2 groups. They had one group of women who they had found that were drinking about 500 milliliters of diet soda per week, had a 15% increase in type 2 diabetes, and those drinking 1.5 liters of diet soda per week had a 59% increase in type 2 diabetes. Okay, crazy stuff. So this is done in France. This is again published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And like, how does that even make sense? Well, let me help you understand this a little bit. So in 2008, there was actually a study done at Purdue University, and they compared rats. So they had one group of rats eat yogurt, which was sweetened with glucose, which is the natural sugar that our cells need in order to produce energy. They had the other group of rats eat yogurt that was sweetened with a 0-calorie substitute called saccharin, which is no longer available in most countries as far as I understand. So here's the cool thing. So the study showed that the rats consuming the 0-calorie sweetener gained more body fat than the group eating the glucose with yogurt. So again, it's just really weird, right? So how does this make sense? Why are we gaining more weight if we're eating these 0-calorie sweeteners? Well, here's the answer, and it really comes down to the wiring our brain requires with respect to food. So normally, sweet foods provide what's called a salient orosensory stimulus that essentially predicts how many calories we're about to intake. So if you have something sweet, your brain knows more or less that you're going to have a certain number of calories coming in with that. However, with these 0-calorie sweeteners, the sweetness isn't followed by calories. Okay, so it becomes, there's kind of an incongruency there. And so what they found is that the breaking of this connection between the sweet sensation and a high-calorie food, it changes our body's ability to regulate intake. And therefore, we have this problem with self-regulation, which might explain why we eat more if we use artificial sweeteners or drink more if we're drinking diet sodas. So it's a really, really fascinating area of research. And so now there's studies that are showing that we're increasing our risk of type 2 diabetes, we're increasing our risk of obesity, and we're literally changing the metabolic response within our body by consuming these synthetically made sweeteners. Okay, now, so that's again going back to sugar versus artificial. So if you were on a stranded island and if you had Coke versus Diet Coke, what would you choose? You had no other options. Well, again, if you had to choose your poison, I'd probably just go with the Coke, right? Because it's, again, sure, it contains however many tablespoons of sugar, but at least, sugar in and of itself is a really problematic compound. But if you were to choose sugar versus aspartame, for instance, I would probably choose sugar. So again, just natural versus synthetic. Natural generally is the way to go. Again, if you only had Coke to choose from, you'd be in big trouble either way. I'm not saying you should drink soda in general. You want to replace that stuff with water, with smoothies, with fresh pressed vegetable juices, with herbal teas. That's the way to go. Okay. Just very quickly, Aspartame is a very, very problematic artificial sweetener. It's found in Coke Zero. I believe most diet sodas still incorporate it, and it's big business. Understand this, that aspartame is huge business. There are lobbyists in Washington that will prevent aspartame from leaving the market, okay? So there's a huge amount of money and backing behind aspartame, and there's so much influence that there's been more than now 166 studies done on aspartame. And of those studies, 74 of them have been funded by aspartame interested parties. And of those 74 studies, 100% of them found no problems for human use. Okay? 100% no problems. Of the other studies, so of the 90 some odd studies that were left, looking at aspartame and safety for humans, so those studies were not funded by aspartame interested parties. 92% of them found that they were not safe. Aspartame was not safe for human consumption. So something to understand, again, science is important, but science has become very, very skewed and biased. It's no longer objective. So it's really, if you have an opinion about something and if you want to find backing for that, well, you can find some literature to support that. That's literally the point we're at now with scientific literature. It's very, very misleading. And it's just so funny that people, put so much weight behind science and research-backed studies. But the reality is that unless you really know who's behind these studies, I mean, the results are really invalid, if at best. So, we look at things like aspartame, very problematic. It's a neurological toxin, so it's an excitotoxin. It excites the neurons in your brain and nervous system, leading to all sorts of different, issues, anxiety, depression, mood disorders, anything you can think of. It's just crazy. 75% of all complaints to the FDA are related to aspartame consumption. Okay, so it's not good at all. So what are some good alternatives to artificial sweeteners? Well, you want to be looking at things like we've got xylitol, which is just fairly recent. Last couple of years has become a little more popular. It's naturally derived from the fiber within plants, and surprisingly, it actually helps to fight cavities. So 0 calories, very healthy for us and our teeth. So it's a really great alternative. You also have stevia, which you probably know about. It's a plant-based sweetener from the sunflower family, 300 times sweeter than sugar. Very, very, there's almost no calories in it. Has a bit of a lingering taste to it, but it's great for baking purposes if you don't want to use sugar and brown sugar and maple syrup and honey and stuff. We use it quite often for a lot of the stuff we do. Then if you want to get into the more natural stuff that has some degree of calories, you got raw honey. Honey has a lot of health benefits to it. So there's a lot of B vitamins in there, a lot of really good properties. And you've got pure maple syrup. Okay, so if you're having good healthy pancakes and you want some sweetness on top, you're not going to throw a package of stevia, right? You're probably going to want some kind of syrup. Don't use Aunt Jemima because it's high fructose corn syrup garbage. Go with raw honey or pure maple syrup. Okay, so again, going back to the natural versus synthetic. And with that said, high fructose corn syrup is a big problem. I want to just finish off our last kind of third bit of health news. This is not so much a piece of health news that's in the news right now, but it's a question that has come up quite a bit. A lot of people, when I've talked about this concept of sugars and the difference between glucose and fructose, and because the reality is that glucose and fructose they're metabolized differently inside the body. Okay, so fructose is a 5-carbon sugar. Okay, glucose is a 6-carbon sugar, and because of that, fructose has to go through the liver to be converted into glucose, and through that pathway, as a byproduct, triglycerides, the types of fat in our body, are formed, and we now know that fructose is a big contributor to weight gain. So when you look at things like sodas, bottled juices, high fructose corn syrup in our foods, all of those, table sugar, all of those at the base have fructose. If you look at, if a package says sugar on it, that essentially means sucrose, okay? Because that's what sugar is, it's sucrose. Sucrose is half glucose, half fructose. So your body can, it can easily assimilate the glucose part, but it has to still metabolize the fructose through the liver. The glucose doesn't have to go to the liver. It can go directly out of the digestive system and literally go right through the blood, from the bloodstream right into your cells. It doesn't need to be processed by your liver. And your cells ultimately need glucose to produce ATP, which is our basic unit of energy. Fructose is very, very problematic, okay? So especially in its processed form. So with that said, a lot of people have asked me, okay, Yuri, well, if fructose isn't good for us, then what about fruit, right? Is fruit going to make me fat? And there's a lot of diet books out there. There's a lot of people who talk about, don't eat fruit because it's going to make you fat and blah, blah, blah. And it's going to, spike your blood sugar. But then there's also the complete opposite end of the spectrum of people who are like fanatical raw foodists who say that, you should only be eating fruit, 30 bananas a day, a watermelon is totally fine. That's the way we're all meant to eat. That's not true either. So anyways, so here's the thing with fruit. So fruit is not problematic in its whole form. Okay, when you eat fruit, what does fruit contain? It contains fructose, but it also contains glucose. The sugar in fruit is not 100% fructose. Okay, if you have a banana, part of that's going to be glucose, part of it's going to be fructose. It's not 100% fructose. Very important to understand. Certain fruits have more fructose than others. Okay, but generally, fruits also contain, well, not generally, they always contain fiber. Okay, so the benefit of fiber is that it delays the gastric emptying of sugar. So it delays how quickly stuff leaves your stomach. So if you have an apple, if you have a banana, if you've got, let's say you have in one sitting, you have 10 fruit at one sitting. You just have a huge fruit salad. Is that going to make you fat? Well, probably not. It'll kind of make you a little bit bloaty initially, just based on the fact that a lot of fructose at the same time is tough to process, and you might get some bloatiness. But the thing is that because it has the fiber, it's going to delay the amount of fructose that's leaving the GI system and going into the liver. Okay, so that's okay. And that's very different than if you're drinking a fruit juice, whether it's fresh pressed fruit or bottled juice. You're going to get that sugar directly, because it's in liquid form, it doesn't contain the fiber. It's going to literally injecting fructose into your liver. Okay, so even if you have a juicer at home and you're making fresh pressed juices, which I highly recommend, do not juice fruits. Okay, so if you're making a green juice, that's terrific, amazing. Do it every single day. Add in an apple if you want for a little bit of sweetness. But if you're juicing like 10 apples and pears and oranges and all that stuff every single day, you are consuming a huge amount of fruit juice, which does not contain the fiber, and therefore you're not going to have that delayed emptying out of your stomach. That's a huge influx of fructose into your liver, and that can be problematic over time. The other thing with fructose is that it actually severs the connection, the communication between leptin and your brain. Leptin is a hormone that tells your brain you're full, so you stop eating, or that you've had enough. Fructose cuts that off, because fructose also leads to higher levels of insulin in the blood, and high insulin also leads to high leptin levels. And if you have too much leptin, all is communicating to your brain, eventually your brain stops responding to it, and that's known as leptin resistance. So fructose can be very bad. It can also, but again, it's not very problematic in its natural form. So going back to our natural versus synthetic form, if you're eating fruit, no problem. If you're making smoothies, no problem, because they contain the fiber. If you're having 8 to 10 fruits a day, it's not an issue. Okay, but if you're having 30 bananas at one sitting, if you're juicing fruit, if you're drinking soda pop all day, if you're drinking, Tropicana orange juice or any of those juices that are readily available in the store, that's when you start running into problems. You also start running into problems when you're consuming a lot of packaged foods, because packaged foods, including sauces and anything else, contain sugar as one of their first ingredients, right? And that's because, we love the taste of sugar. But again, if you see sugar, half of that is fructose right off the top. And that's going to become a big problem. All right. So with that said, we've got some action steps for this week. Okay. Very simple. Go through your fridge, go through your pantry, start removing some stuff that's in a package or box. It's very simple. If you go to your pantry and you see a bunch of boxes, you could probably just throw all of it out. I know that's not going to be nice. You're wasting a lot of money, whatever. But I'm telling you, if you want to start moving to better health, and I'm sure you're very health conscious already, otherwise you wouldn't be listening to me right now, you need to start making those kind of decisions. Okay, get rid of the crackers, get rid of the chips, just get rid of it all, okay? Go to your fridge. You see a lot of packaged stuff, a lot of sauces, a lot of that kind of stuff. You want to remove it, okay? You want to have a very simple fridge, a very simple kitchen. It should just be fresh produce and some staples, some beans, cans of beans if you want. Very, very simple stuff, nuts and seeds. And, if you're into animal products, you can have some good, free-range eggs, some good organic grass-fed beef, or types of fish or chicken, whatever it is that you eat. And that's the way we want to consume our food. Okay, that's really the basis of good health. It's not very complicated in theory. Application is obviously a little bit different when you want your treats and all that other stuff. So you just do the best with what you can. But again, rule of thumbs: butter better than margarine. Sugar is better than artificial sweeteners. So if you're having a coffee at Starbucks, you might as well just put in a little bit of brown sugar versus the Splenda or Sweet and Low. Okay. And then if you're having fruit, just keep it in its whole form. Don't go crazy with fruit juicing, and obviously remove or heavily reduce your consumption of packaged foods that contain sugar, or just packaged foods in general, and you'll be a lot better off. So we've covered a ton of ground today. It's been really exciting. I'm really happy you've stuck with me for episode 1. Don't forget, tune in every single week. I'm going to be pumping out incredible content for you. I'm going to be giving you my opinions and insights on the latest breaking news in health, because a lot of it out there is absolute garbage. And I'm here to cut through the crap and give you the goods. So until next week, I'm Yuri Elkaim signing off. And again, don't forget to join me at supernutritionacademy.com so you too can learn how to master your health and nutrition. Until next week, have a great day, and we'll talk to you then.